Hello and welcome to our program. For those of you here in the room, we really appreciate you braving the cold weather to be with us tonight. For those of us at home viewing remotely, we appreciate you as well. Thank you for joining us. Here at the Watkins, we've been pleased to host a unique exhibit of original artifacts titled Bundle Up, Battling the Cold in 1850s Kansas. On display through March 16th, this exhibit is a collaboration with the Merchant Tailor Museum. And today we have Eric Smallwood, historian and tailor of 19th century menswear and one of the best dressed guys I know, to share his knowledge of how Kansans in the early years of settlement survived harsh winter nights, much like the one tonight, or maybe even colder. We'll also take this opportunity to let everyone know about our winter clothing drive. So we've partnered with the Ballard Center, and through the end of February, you can bring in winter clothing items like gloves, scarves, coats, hats, that sort of thing, and drop them off for people in the community in need. We've been really gratified by the great response that the drive has had so far. They've come out to empty the bins twice already, and we just started it at the beginning of this month. So we really appreciate that response, and we hope you'll bring some items by to donate as well. Although, if they date to the 19th century, maybe offer them to Eric first. So with that, I will turn the program over to Eric Smallwood.
Thank you, Bill. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out today and supporting the museum and the exhibit and our program we're doing. And thank you if you're tuning in at home today. I don't blame you. It's wherever you are, it's probably pretty cold. Here it's 7, 8 degrees, I think. It feels like that. My name is Eric Smallwood. I'm a curator at the Merchant Tailor Museum, and I'm also a site administrator here at the Kansas Historical Society. The Merchant Tailor Museum was founded a couple years ago, and we really focus on men's clothing from about 1845 to about 1865. And if you're familiar or a history buff with American history, you know that's a pretty important time in American history. A lot of things happened between those 20 years.
Where is that museum?
So our museum is digital right now. We don't really have a brick and mortar location. We're trying to do more exhibits, kind of like the one here at the Watkins, where we can bring things out to people to be able to see. But right now you can visit it. It's called the Merchant Tailor Museum, and all of that is digital right now. It's free and accessible, and we're trying to make that more accessible to more folks all over. Our program today, we're really going to be talking about mostly men's clothing. The Merchant Tailor Museum really focuses on men's clothing in that time period. We're going to kind of talk about how Kansans as a whole would have prepared for winter with their everyday dress in those first, 6, 7 years of Kansas settlement. So if you're not familiar, Kansas was opened for white settlement in 1854 as a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And over the next few years, you would have thousands of folks coming from all over the U.S., most notably from places like New England, Kentucky, even places like Georgia, and flocking to this new promised land of Kansas to settle this untamed land, as they considered it. So if you read about that history, you get into the winters of 1854, the winters of 1855, and those are some harsh winters. And a lot of those early settlers don't stay here. They go home because it's a lot easier to tough out the cold in an area that's already been settled. There's already more infrastructure. But the ones who stayed here and the ones who finish settling Kansas and eventually make it a state in 1861, the same year the Civil War starts, they prepare for winter pretty similar to how we do still today. So we're really going to work our way from the underclothing up to the top layers of mostly men's clothing, but we're going to talk about some women's stuff too, and really talk about what is the same and what's different with cold weather clothing today and 170 years ago. If you have any questions while we're doing the program, just raise your hand. I'll try to get to them. We're going to have a time after the whole thing wraps up just to let everyone ask some questions. Is there a way to for people to ask questions on the live stream?
There are, yeah.
Perfect.
Mm-hmm. I'll let you know if we get some questions popping up.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
And after we're done with our PowerPoint, I'm also going to have some time I'll stand up here and have time to have everybody come up and actually look at some of our artifacts and reproductions I brought out. We have a few original pieces here behind me today and around me, but a lot of the things out here today that we're displaying for this program are reproductions, faithful like museum quality reproductions, either based on specific originals or using original garment techniques to produce things the best way possible. And that's so that you all can pick things up and handle them and not worry about harming an original artifact. So we're going to go ahead and start our PowerPoint here. Kansas is opened for settlement in 1854. For the first few years, you see a lot of temporary housing. Sometimes that's in the way of prefabricated structures. Sometimes that's in the way of cabins, kind of like this from this sketch of Topeka in 1854. And if y'all have ever been in a real thin frame prefab house in the 1850s, maybe not a lot of us, it doesn't have a lot of insulation. It doesn't really keep you warm. So you have to dress warm in the process. This is one of my favorite images, photographs taken of early Kansas. This was taken, I believe, sometime in 1854 or early 1855. And it is of William Likens, pictured right here in the center, with members of his family. Here, one of the first permanent structures built here in Lawrence. This photo was taken at some point in the winter or at some point in some cold weather, because Mr. Likens and the other gentlemen beside him here on either side are wearing undershirts and overshirts, items that I'm going to talk about here throughout the program that are things you would really dress for the winter. As far as I've been able to tell, this is one of the earliest photos that show people dressed for the cold here in Kansas and right here in Lawrence. Here's another famous image you all may have seen. This was taken likely sometime in 1856 or 57. This daguerreotype is in the collection of the Kansas Historical Society. And if you zoom into that, you can see that a lot of these guys also have a lot of winter wear. Now, I'm going to talk more about all these pieces, but it's good to show you these up front because there were people out here freezing just like we were probably walking up to the museum today. So when we're talking about men's clothing in the 1850s, this is the time Kansas was a territory from 1854 to 1861. So we're going to focus on that mid to late 1850s time period, real short part of American history. Men's clothing is kind of split into two main categories. We at the Merchant Taylor Museum kind of took the namesake of one of those main ways, main outlets of clothing production. An item could either be tailor-made or, for the most part, either tailor-made or what people in the period would call ready-made. And we may be more familiar with ready-made clothing today, but tailor-made clothing, I think it's a little better quality than usually it would be. So tailor-made clothing is bespoke. It's usually made custom for the wearer. If you go to a tailor shop and you have to make something custom, you're getting it tailored to your body, to your proportions. That tailor or their apprentices are either going to draft something based on your measurements or draft something close enough to your measurements and alter it to fit you better. Skilled tailors and apprentices offered high-quality clothing. In Kansas specifically, there aren't a whole lot of tailors early on. By 1860, I found at least 4 tailors in Lawrence that had permanent residences and storefronts here. So people could still get custom clothing. Being a higher quality, that clothing is usually a lot more expensive. Just like today, if any of us would like to go out and buy a custom-made suit, there aren't a lot of people that make them anymore. It's going to be pretty high quality, and it's going to cost a pretty penny. Now, ready-made clothing, on the flip side of that, had been around for quite a while, had been around for a few decades, but by the time of the 1850s, it was really becoming the dominant way to source clothing in general. We're probably used to that today. If you go to a store and you buy a shirt and it's a size medium or a size large, or you buy a pair of pants and they're in, let's say, 34, 30, or whatever size you wear, that's a general size. So that's not tailor-made to anybody. You may need certain measurements that fit that clothing, but it's not bespoke, as we would call it. Now, that quality may not be quite as high. A lot of ready-made clothing that survives still today is what we would call, comparatively, a little lesser quality to something that was tailored for somebody. But lesser quality, they can pump out more things for more people. You can stock shelves with a lot of the same items in similar sizes. It's going to be a lot cheaper. One thing that really starts to boost this ready-made market is this little thing called westward expansion. So in 1846, we declared war on Mexico. 2 years later, we take a huge part of their property. We call that the Mexican Cession. Year after that, in 1849, guess what they find in California? They find gold. A lot of people start to flock to that over 1851, 52. The interest in the West really, really grows. Do you think there's tailors and a bunch of cloth going to California and they're tailoring a bunch of clothing for people? Yeah, there's a little bit of that. Most of that clothing is going to be shipped in bulk. A lot of that bulk, or a lot of that shipping clothing, that would have happened a lot over the years of the Santa Fe Trails trade. That really spikes the ready-made clothing production. And by 1850, it was at an all-time high. That's going to just continue pretty much until we're here today, where there's really not a lot of tailor-made clothing. Most things are ready-made. Do we have any questions about those while we're still on the slide?
I've never seen the word tourists before.
Yes, yeah, that's one I don't see very much anymore. So a lot of ready-made clothing too. We may think of the factories in New England. But those factories, for a lot of the cases, those are like cutting factories or cutting facilities. Usually those things are kind of subcontracted out. So a lot of those clothing, let's say if you were a sewist or a private sewist, you may not be a skilled tailor. You didn't go to school or apprentice with somebody to become a tailor, but you can sew. I'm sure there are a lot of us in here that can. You would make an extra few bucks by going to some of these facilities. They would pretty much give you packages or groupings of things. You would take those home and you would finish them. You'd bring them back, you get a paycheck. There's a lot of trust involved in that. I don't know how well it'll go today. But that's kind of how those things are being made. So these aren't people I would call necessarily like seamstresses. A lot of the time they can be men or women. And in the process, a lot of times in the period, I see these people referred to as sewists.
Were they using sewing machines at that time, or was it hand sewing?
There's a lot of hand sewing. So a lot of the things I'm going to talk about, there were sewing machines that were coming around by the late 1840s, and that really picks up in numbers. There were even sewing machines out in Kansas by 1860. But a lot of garments that I'm going to talk about here today, you can machine sew a lot of parts of them, but to construct them the way that was the norm in that time period, some things you just have to do by hand. And they didn't see that as being any more of a hassle because that was the norm anyway. The machine saved you a few minutes here and there, but the overall garment would still have to be put together by hand a lot of the time.
I've not seen the word sewist before. Is that neutral gender, or because there's seamstress? So it's.
I believe it is kind of a neutral term. I see it used a lot in context with like female folks who were sewing, but I also see it in context with males in the period. So this is something in the mid-19th century, people use this word a lot more than we do today. And there were a lot more men that sew probably than today. So I would say that's a neutral term. So here's one of my favorite photos of Warrants. Actually, this is in the collection of, Jules Martino. Can't read that. Sorry about that. That's a weird font. And this is a photo of Massachusetts Street. Some of these buildings are actually still here today. The Free State Hotel can be seen here with the clothing ad over here on the far right. But the store I'm really looking at is the New York store by Mr. L. Boline. That store today is Weaver's. It's still here today. It's moved a couple times from different raids. Every time they raid Lawrence, he buys a different property, moves a little bit, gets a bigger and bigger building, and eventually his, I believe, his son-in-law takes it over with the Weaver last name. Still remains as Weaver's today. The Boline store would have sold ready-made clothing, absolutely. A lot of stores in Lawrence would have had these. This is an option for people to buy things in bulk, cheaper than getting things tailor-made. And here's a photo of a tailor shop that is in Colchester, Connecticut, that we have the image in the collection at the Merchant Tailor Museum that shows kind of how one of these would have looked on the inside. There are a couple machines. This tailor shop would have likely dated to the early 1860s, just a tad after Kansas's territorial period, but not a lot would have changed in those few years before. There are machines, but there are also folks doing things by hand, like you can see right here in the foreground. So we're going to start talking about the nitty-gritty of what these garments are. Because we may look at a lot of things. We may watch period piece movies or films or TV shows, and we see garments on TV. We may not know what those mean. I see a lot of people that when I'm wearing this stuff at a living history event or an interpretive event, people either ask me one or two things: if I'm Willy Wonka or if I'm Abraham Lincoln. I always get. I'm not sure which I'd rather be, but probably Abraham Lincoln. Seems dangerous, but. You may see these things in movies and films, but I want you all to leave here today or sign off today with a better understanding of actually what you're looking at. The next time you watch a period movie or a period piece set in the mid-1800s, something Charles Dickens, Christmas Carol-esque, I want you to have a better idea of what you're looking at and have a better appreciation for folks that study this stuff and reproduce this stuff for film. So right here off the bat, we have 6 undershirts. Now I'm sure a lot of us have undershirts on right now. These are things you may wear. Today we might have t-shirts or like Henleys that are worn underneath of like a normal button-up shirt or normal clothing. In the 19th century, in the mid-19th century, undershirts were very common. So these undershirts would have typically been cheaper than a normal higher quality shirt, like a dress shirt, or something that I have on today. And I have an undershirt on here as well. It helps to protect, back to the tailor shop. It helps to protect the actual shirt and make it last, let it last longer, so you don't have to spend as much money on the outer layers that are seen. Of the 3 of these that we see, the 3 on the top, one of them is actually on display with our bundle up exhibit. These were actually recovered from the SS Central American that sank in 1857, returning from California off the coast of the Carolinas. These shirts are knit. They are machine knit in a tube, basically, and then you kind of construct them and put them together. Here's a reproduction of one of these. This is what they look like. And they are tube knit. And if you notice something pretty odd about these is the placket in the center can offset. Now, why do you think that might be the case?
Because you've got the placket of your outer shirt right here. It might be uncomfortable if you have the inner one there too.
Absolutely. Those can interfere. Now, this is a fashion I see in European fashions a little earlier in this time period, but it helps to kind of lessen bulk. Most of the way that people were dressing in the 19th century are to mainly reduce bulk and to give a certain physique or a certain silhouette. That's kind of the goal, just like we still dress today. But these knit undershirts could either be made out of knit wool, knit silk, knit cotton. I've seen silk wool blends as well, and they're very, very comfortable. The other 3 undershirts we have underneath are sewn together out of cottons, I believe. And these would have been a little thicker, but for something more like layers. If you're doing a lot of work outside, you don't want to harm your more expensive clothing or your higher quality clothing. You're going to wear something underneath, kind of let that last longer. Here's an inside of one of the ones we have on the one we have on exhibit out here as well. This shirt was manufactured by Brooks Brothers. We've probably heard that name a few times. It's still today, it's a pretty high-end clothing company. And the shirt that we have recovered in our exhibit was one of those made by the Brooks Brothers company in the 1850s. If you notice our shirt in the case out here, you'll notice that there's a little stamp. It's kind of hard to see. That stamp is a proof stamp to pretty much proof the wool or the cloth to let you know that it's 100% merino. We have tags on shirts today. They didn't have paper tags in that time period a lot of the time, other than maybe general sizes on like coats and pants. But for things like this, to stamp it approval or stamp it to get ready to go out the door, this is that type of a stamp. The stamp that's on our shirt, I've blown up here, the clearer image, so we can all see what that looks like. It's a cute little sheet with a bow wrapped around it. I wish we were still putting stamps like this on clothing. And the moment you've all been waiting for, it's time to talk about the drawers. I know a lot of us have probably seen the large knit drawers out here in our exhibit, but drawers were all shapes and sizes in the time period. Drawers or like underwear that you would wear would go under your pants. And this would be like your main form of underwear in the period. Most all of the time they're full length, but I have seen shorter length ones like 3/4 length and even ones that were cut down. And these could also be sewn with cloth or knit, kind of like these knit shirts, the pair we have up on the top right. This is the pair we have on display with our exhibit. They are hand knit as opposed to machine knit. And these machines were not really like a large scale machine like you would think of today. They still have hand crank tube knitting machines as well. You would see socks, drawers, the tube knit to make shirts, all made out of the same stuff. But I really like this pair as well, in particular, because it's hand knit. And if you notice in the top here, you see there's almost a little V, 2 lines coming down the seat. That was an extension. It's really common for people in the 19th century to not throw away a garment or even to just get rid of it or give it to somebody else. You're going to fix it, especially if you like it. And if it's too big, you can cut it and bring it in. And if it's too small, you can actually put what's called a gusset in there and actually enlarge that size. Here's a few pairs of socks that were aboard the steamboat Arabia. Aboard the steamboat Arabia that sank in September of 1856. It's a great resource if you haven't been there yet. I highly recommend it. And there's one of the best places to go to see clothing from this time period. Now that sank and it was on the Kansas side of the border when it covered, I believe, in the 1980s, I believe. And so being that was headed to the gold fields up in, I believe, Montana, headed to, at the time, these were items that would have definitely passed through this area. A lot of these things are being supplied to not only parts of Kansas, but parts of Nebraska, what's it called? Missouri, California, and now Colorado, after that Colorado gold rush begins around 1859. The shirt is a main part of men's clothing in this period. It's kind of the core of the suit. Plain white shirts were essential in a 19th century man's wardrobe. Every guy would have had one. It would have been pretty hard pressed to not see or not find a man that had one in some quality. Even cow rustlers in New Mexico in the 1850s are wearing white pleated shirts. They're just torn up and dirty because they're out working. People that are higher class, you may see pictures of like Jim Lane or John Brown, folks who are a little more prominent in Kansas history, that are a little higher class. Those folks are also wearing white shirts. It's one of those universal garments that a lot of us might still have, or a lot of us would have in that period. They were usually made out of a fine linen, a shirt quality linen, or a cotton. And you can also have lesser quality ones that weren't quite pleated, but had a single placket coming down just the center, similar to how we just have a button-up flannel shirt like that today. Shirts didn't have to be white, however. You see calico shirts, which are, calicos are printed cottons, usually 2 or 3 colors at least, and usually subtle patterns are used. These are all different examples of mid-19th century shirts that are different pattern and colors. You may see shirts, kind of like the blue one, second from the left here, that would have been used for mostly labor type work. This is that type of a shirt, similar to lined, half line. They are able to take a lot more wear and tear than something of a finer linen that you see people wearing, with like a suit on here.
Some of them seem kind of long.
They're very long. So the reason for that is the way that people were dressing in that period. Your drawers are your underwear, but your shirt is also kind of part of that as well. Your shirt is to be long enough that you can tuck it into places and cover everything that needs to be covered without having a separate layer. So undershirts, normal shirts, even overshirts, which we're going to talk about next, are usually pretty long so that they actually cover all of the body that needs to be covered. A lot of people see these and see the length and they associate it with like a nightgown. Men's dressing gowns and nightshirts are much, much longer than these, but these are still pretty long in comparison to us today. Something that I see a lot on mid-19th century shirts are removable collars. We have one on display. It's the one, it's actually the one all the way on the left. It's on display with our bundle up exhibit. It was recovered from the SS Central American Shipwreck from 1857, and it was one of 3 that we have in the collection today. There are different types. These are 3 different variations of pretty much the same type of collar that are made in different patterns. Now, the reason these were so popular or so important is if you've ever worn a shirt that you really like for a long time that has a collar on it, that part around the collar is what's going to get crusty and gross first, that and the armpits. So usually you'd see these collars to make your shirt last longer or to make it look like your shirt is a little cleaner than it might have been. You might have a removable collar that you can take on and off, wash it separately. We kind of have a few of those at your house or in stock, so you don't worry about wearing the same thing quite every single day. Now, the collar we have up on the top right, it's actually made of a paper, linen paper. Paper collars start to become a lot more popular through the 1850s. By the time of the Civil War, especially when the Civil War starts with all of the cotton production kind of being excluded from the U.S. economy for a few years, paper, linen paper specifically, kind of becomes that dominant material. So if you see people wearing paper collars, that's kind of where that starts to come from. This is one of my favorite individuals in the Territorial Kansas period. This guy named James Redpath. He was an editor for the New York Tribune. He actually joined John Brown in campaigns through the campaigns of 1856. He's at the Battle of Blackjack. Later on, he's at some of the battles later on. He's here at during the Wakarusa War in Lawrence that happened in December 1855. He was very active in the anti-slavery movement here in Kansas. And he wrote about it quite a bit. Some of the best firsthand accounts of the Territorial Kansas period and some of those bleeding Kansas battles come from accounts from James Redpath. But he's seen here in this famous photo wearing a wool shirt. Now, a lot of us have flannels on even in this room today. Flannel shirts are a popular part of our clothing. It's kind of a mid-layer. That's what I would call it, at least like a middle layer. Usually you would wear an undershirt underneath of it, but you can put this on over top and you can still put a jacket on over it. So wool shirts are kind of that middle ground or a middle layer of clothing that men are going to wear either as a top layer if it's warm out or as an under layer if it's colder out. It's one of those things, just like today, you may see people wearing a flannel shirt as their actual jacket or a flannel shirt underneath of their coat. And it's pretty similar. The one he has on the left is pretty similar to this one on display at the Steamboat Arabian Museum as well. These wool shirts are typically single placket, and what that means is there's a single row of buttons that go down the front to kind of close it all up. But they could also be what a lot of people call shield fronts, or a lot of people call them minor shirts, almost like a double placket. Now this kind of makes it counterproductive to wear that offset placketed undershirt because it does have 2 rows of buttons that create a little bit different bulk. These are kind of what those look like. It's not very heavy wool. It's made out of a wool flannel, which can be either a straight woven or a twill woven, thinner, looser wool that could even be what's called napped to kind of raise that up, make it a little puffier, a little more comfortable and soft. But they wouldn't have to be. You would see you would see overshirts like this being worn all times of the year. It's one of those all season garments. For some comparison, here's a couple other styles that you would see in the period. Here's one on the right that has a single placket down the front, and the one on the left has almost like an imitated 3. In the period, we would call that triple-breasted because there are 3 rows of buttons. And that would have been another style seen pretty frequently. So there we go. And I'll get back to it later, but one of the men in that photo of Free State troops taken in Lawrence in 1856 has on pretty much the exact same shirt you see here on the left. So now we're going to talk about pants a little bit. Pants go through a big change during the 1850s. The later 1840s, around the time of the Mexican-American War, you start to see what we call French fly trousers becoming a lot more common with younger men's fashions. Broad fall trousers, like the ones we have shown up here, they close a little differently. A lot of people call them they call it a union suit flap, but this flap on the front is the fly of your pants. And this flap part can fall down just like the picture here on the left, or excuse me, on the right on our PowerPoint. And that is your main fly of your pants. That is how that closes. I see that every once in a while. I see, of all things, I see women's pants kind of, this is coming back, I think, right now in fashion. I've been seeing a lot more of this the past few years. But in the later 1840s, that starts to change and shift to a French fly. That's what we're still pretty much using today. That's a single placket or a single button fly. No zippers yet, no belt loops quite yet. People are still wearing belts, but a lot of that would have just been held on with the tension of the belt itself. Do you have any questions about broadfall trousers or how that fly works? Yeah.
Was that an economic change or was that like a fashion change?
Pretty much a fashion change. Yeah. And now broadfall trousers were kind of the norm in the later 1830s into the 1840s. By the late 1840s, that starts to really shift. And during the 1850s, while Kansas was being settled, you see a lot of broadfalls and a lot of French fly trousers. It's one of those weird things. You would have seen a lot of both. Older folks are pretty used to wearing the things that they had the whole time they were in their prime and everything. They're going to hold on to those fashions for a little longer. So you even see broadfall trousers well into the Civil War era, about 15 years after they were starting to go out of fashion. Here's 3 pairs of French fly trousers that we have in the collection at the Merchant Taylor Museum. If you notice, between these and the pair after here, these are all pretty much black. And one pair that's brown, I suppose, but they're all dark colors, kind of the pair that I have on here today. Now, they didn't have to be darker colors, but most often I see men's clothing for everyday pants are pretty subtle. And a lot of the time, it's kind of like buying cars in the 1910s. You can have any color you want as long as that color is black. That's kind of the rule of thumb. But they didn't have to be black. In fact, there are 3 great references to mid-1850s trousers in Kansas that are different patterns. The trousers in the center are on display at the Steamboat Railway Museum, which sank in September 1856. That same month, the Battle of Hickory Point happens. It was one of the largest battles of the bleeding Kansas period. On the left is a lithograph, a zoomed-in lithograph from William Grayman, who was an eyewitness and veteran of the battle. He drew one of these gentlemen with a pretty similar pair of pants, though the resolution's a little poor, a similar pair of checkered pants as the one we see here. And Samuel Reeder painted another individual in his painting of Hickory Point, the same battle, with very, very similar pants. So checkered pants, window pane pattern trousers, and even striped trousers were becoming very, very popular during this period. Yeah.
Were they influenced by the nature of where they had come from?
Absolutely.
True.
Absolutely, yeah. So as far as like immigrants and folks coming across, once they reach the United States, they are in the realm of United States manufacturing. So you may have folks that are coming from, say, England. They may have come over with the clothing they had, but the clothing they're going to be buying here, for the most part, is going to be about the same as everybody else. But people all have different tastes, just like all of us today. Some of us dress a little more bland. Some of us like dressing in muted colors. Everyone has their own tastes with color schemes and how we pick out what we wear. A lot of people back then, just like today, couldn't care less. They buy plain black suits. It's pretty normal. But you do see a lot of people that are influenced by where they're from, or their personal backgrounds, or their personal tastes. A lot of times in the 19th century, I'll see accounts of folks in very flashy, colorful outfits. And the reason they were usually wrote down is because it was unusually flashy in that time period, something radical. But that stuff definitely existed. Usually you would see patterned trousers worn a little less, but still pretty common. Another way you could actually express yourself with color and personal taste is with your waistcoat. My waistcoat today is plain black silk, satin silk. That was pretty normal. We have one on display here behind me, and I believe we might have another satin silk one on display in the exhibit. But they could be all sorts of different shapes and sizes and all sorts of different patterns. Waistcoats could be made out of wool. They can be made out of linen for the summertime, or even certain cottons that are called wash vests for labor or summer wear. But for the wintertime, you're usually going to want one made of. We have a few different wool ones and velvet vests as well. And you see they're in all different colors, but for the most part, they're all still pretty subtle, even though they're different colors. It's still kind of subtle designs. People didn't want to dress entirely too loud. Usually you only wanted 1 or 2 statement pieces, as it was called, to kind of give some pizzazz to your outfit. And if you had more than that, it might be a little too loud. Yeah.
I'm assuming it was also a class thing. Whatever middle class meant, and then dress more quietly than, say, upper class.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the real crazy looking vests that survive today are they're tailor-made vests, the little higher quality vests. And a lot of the ready-made vests I see are pretty plain, either black or brown wools, dark blue wools. You also see a lot of like plain silks that are kind of the ready-made style. Here's the inside of one of these waistcoats. These waistcoats were usually padded in the chest. Usually there can either be quilting. Sometimes we even have padding that's in a separate like pillow that you insert into men's vests. And that is surprisingly to us today, it's actually to give you what they call in the period, almost like a pigeon chested silhouette from the side. Is to kind of make you look a little more buff. You can have a huge gut as long as your chest is out farther, allowing in your notes. And so you see that being pretty normal in that time period. Sometimes vests can have a little less padding. Sometimes they can have a little more padding. It depends on the person, depends on their build, depends on what they really want to look like. Another mid layer that I really like to talk about, we have overshirts or a layer you can kind of wear as a top layer or an under layer. That can be the same thing with waistcoats. But it can also be the same instance with sweaters. There are two different sweaters. The one on the right is one as a top layer, as somebody would wear, like as their top layer they're wearing out. But on the left, you see a gentleman that's actually wearing one under his jacket. Sweaters are another one of those things that a lot of people had in that time period, but they weren't necessarily used the same as they are today. Here's a couple surviving sweaters that were aboard the steamboat Berkshire, which sank a little after Kansas became a state up in Nebraska. But these are two that were from about 1865 on that steamboat that sank. If you've noticed, there's a common theme. Boats that sink, we tend to find a lot of clothing on those boats because nobody, it's like the last thing people really want to dig up out of it. So a lot of those references that we have here today are from different ships that have sank at some point in the 1850s. And the clothing was either preserved in trunks or shipping containers or other areas where the air wasn't quite able to get to them and let them deteriorate. I know these look deteriorated, but. So we've kind of worked our way up the main parts of a man's suit. We're getting to kind of that top layer of coats. The coat that I have today is called a frock coat. And we see these a lot in Charles Dickens movies. You might see these in the Muppets Christmas Carol. Some really good frock coats in there. And frock coats are one of those quintessential parts of the mid-19th century wardrobe that like everybody recognizes. I'm sure everybody would, they don't know what it's called, but everybody would see one and recognize that that's a 19th century men's coat. And the reason frock coats, I think, are so unique is because frock coats are the only coat that have a separate skirt like this that protrudes from the waist. So the coat is actually constructed like a jacket for the most part in a 4 or 6 panel body, depending on how it's made. And the skirt is a separate piece that wraps all the way around. And the reason for that is to give you a certain silhouette. It's the same reason that women are wearing bustles in the late 19th century, late 18th century as well, is to give that certain physique. Now, frock coats, even today, they're kind of works of art. Every single one is a little different. I'm going to talk a little bit about, I have one of them on display here as well. We'll see after we're all done. But as you see, they were very popular. Frock coats were one of those everyday garments that to us, it may look like a fancy tux, like a suit jacket that's a little more dressy, but people wore them all the time. They're just very in quality. One of the main themes I see in 19th century clothing is that lower quality folks or lower class folks have the same stuff. It's just made a little less quality than higher class folks. So frock coats could be worn by folks traveling the country, going to California. They're, could be worn by folks wanting to work in courthouse in DC. It didn't really matter. What really mattered was that the fashions were kind of consistent with the time.
I saw you put your frock coat on and it didn't look like it was real comfortable. It looks like the sleeves are real constricted.
So, yeah, I gained a little bit of weight. Good observation though. So the frock coat that I have on is patterned off of a couple of different ones in the Mercer Taylor collection, and those were from the mid-1850s. So in the 1850s, there are certain fashion, real specific trends that you really see in those periods. And in the late 1840s, well, through the 1840s and into the early 1850s, it's pretty common to have a real fitted sleeve. My sleeve might fit a little more fitted than I'd probably like it to. I have an undershirt on, so it's a little more bulky. But having it as a tighter fit is to keep it closer to the body. And in turn, even though I've gained a little weight, it makes me look thinner because my arms look thinner. It makes me look a little lankier than I would be. It gives me that Abraham Lincoln silhouette kind of.
And what is the closure on the front of your frock coat? Is it a hook and eye or?
So this little gadget is called a tibby, and I see these quite often on frock coats, overcoats, even waistcoats sometimes can have them if they kind of come up to the top. You see a tibby kind of closing and appear by the neck. And these tibbies, in this case for a double-breasted frock coat, it's 2 buttons, and they button on each side of the buttonholes. There are buttonholes on both sides of this coat. These frock coats and other types of coats could either be just like shirts, single-breasted or double-breasted. That's kind of the norm in that time period. This is a double-breasted coat, which means there's 2 rows of buttons and 2 rows of buttonholes. If I button this all the way, which I'm not going to because I have the microphone under here, probably won't shut, it would close and you would see 2 rows of buttons down the center. It's pretty common though. Most folks in the period, they don't wear these to close them. You can't see your waistcoat. It's a little more constricting. You usually can close them, but a lot of times people are going to wear them open. Now, something I've found in my experience living in New Mexico and Colorado, a lot of wind out there, a lot of wind out here, and that coat is open, and nothing is more annoying than coat blowing open and getting all over the place and your stuff falling out. Yeah.
Left over right or right over left?
So men's clothing, good question though. In the time period and still today, you can go to Walmart and check it if don't believe me. Men's clothing buttons, the buttons are on the user's right-hand side and the buttonholes are on the user's left-hand side. So men's clothing, the left side crosses over the, what is it?
It's 9
Today or?
No, in events.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Didn't know that. Well, that's usually kind of the norm usually that you see. It's one of the ways you can kind of tell. There's like women's work blouses you might find in the 19th century. They're buttoned like a man's work blouse, but for the most part, that's kind of the. Here's a few double-breasted frock coats we have on the left that are all part of our collection. One of them, the one on the top left, is actually on display here in our suit. It was actually owned by a gentleman named Daniel Smith, who was married in this coat in January 1853. So this was a coat he wore to his early winter wedding about 171 years ago. On the right, we have a single-breasted frock coat. It's pretty similar in construction. It's a brown color, and it has, if you see, just a single placket coming down the center. Here's a close-up of the inside of those frock coats. Frock coats have a lot of quilting that helps to keep the padding in. I mentioned the waistcoats use padding to give yourself more of like that silhouette that you need. Frock coats do as well. I've never seen a frock coat that didn't, a wool frock coat that didn't have padding in it or didn't have quilting to some extent in it. Now, with the introduction of the sewing machine, that quilting can become a little more elaborate. And by the late 1850s, you start to see that in all sorts of different shapes and patterns, which we'll actually see here on the original frock coat after a bit. There was a piece of paper that identifies this coat to a Daniel Smith, where he got and how he got married in this coat, and kind of a description of that. It's lined in a silk. We see frock coats lined in either a silk or an alpaca. You can see a wool silk blend. A lot of people call farmer silk. It's kind of a cheaper alternative. It still looks like silk. It still may appear to feel like a silk fabric, but at the end of the day, it's a little cheaper to produce because half of those fibers are wool or cotton rather than silk. Here are a couple more frock coats that show just different types of quilting. That quilting can be anywhere from the skirt down through the chest, down through the back panels here. And that's going to kind of provide more structure so that you kind of get that silhouette that you're looking for. This probably sounds like a lot of overkill for a suit coat, doesn't it? Now, where a lot of frock coats may lack in pizzazz on the outside, they might have on the inside. Sleeve linings are usually made of a cotton or a silk, and they can be usually white, but here's are 8 frock coats that we have in our collection from the territorial period of Kansas that all have different types of sleeve linings in them. It's a way just basically to get rid of extra scrap fabric if you have extra color fabric. Silks provide an easier, it lets your arm glide a little easier into the coat, makes it a little more comfortable and easy to get in and out of it. And they can be all different colors. If you notice, they're kind of earlier to later, they kind of do get a little more subtle and a little less flashy, but there were still other types as well. I see stripes and even colored sleeve linings well in the 1860s. So frock coats are the main type of coat that a lot of men are going to be wearing in this time period, but most coats in the most men's coats in the 1850s can be classified into 2 main categories. You have frock coats, which have a skirt that wraps around. That's a separate piece that's not integrally all the same panel on the coat. But you also have coats that are called paletots, which might look like a frock coat, but that's all one integral panel. So sack coats, things you might read about even in the 1860s Civil War time period, those are all considered palatines. The word we may not hear a lot today, it's not the exercise machine. It's a type of garment. I know we were all thinking it. But they still may look like frock coats, and they could still be a higher class coat. This is made a little different. These really gained popularity by the Civil War, by Kansas statehood, and well into the 1860s. By the time the Civil War ends, people were wearing at least more palatot cut sack coats, as they're called in the time period, because they look like a sack. They're a little less fitting than there are really in the earlier decade. They are, by the late 1850s, that style does start to change. So this is a good example. The sleeves that I have on here are cylindrical all the way down through the cuff. It's not really tapered as much as these. Now, a lot of people, a lot of fashion historians call these D sleeves or D-shaped sleeves, because one side is a little tapered and the other side has a big bend in it. And the point of that is to make it look like your hands are a little smaller and make it look, I guess, like you have larger arms. I'm not really sure. But it does kind of give you that different silhouette. That silhouette starts to change a lot. By the time of the 1860s, all those pictures of Abraham Lincoln and his coats you see at Antietam or DC, a lot of the times he'll have this big sleeve that's kind of in fashion at that time period. But in Kansas in the territorial years, you would have seen both pretty common. So we're going to talk a little bit about overcoats. Overcoats, where do you think they go? They go over your coat. That's exactly right. And so we have two different overcoats on display in our bundle up exhibit. We have up here on the screen. The one on the right is actually here in front of us. This coat here is an overcoat cut in, just like all those coats, either in frock pattern or a palatot pattern. This one is cut in. It's a frock pattern. There is a skirt protruding from this. It's an extra piece. The pockets on the skirt here help to kind of give extra access to things if you need to carry your overcoat. It's a little hard to get to your tail pockets in your frock coat if you have something on over top of it. So these extra pockets you see sometimes on overcoats can make it a little easier to access. And it is also made out of a little denser wool. Something I haven't really talked about much is the fiber content of the things that these are made of. So most of these items, like the pants and the frock coats and palatot coats, the main suits, those are made out of a wool cloth, usually a wool broadcloth that's straight woven. So it's not woven on a twill or a different, it's kind of just straight woven. Usually it's fulled and it's very, very dense. And the reason for that is to give yourself a very specific drape. You don't want that fabric to stretch, because the whole point of tailoring it and cutting it to a certain pattern is so that it fits a certain way. If it starts to stretch out on you, you're going to get a big sack and it's not going to fit you very well. But these overcoats are made out of a thicker wool than these other types of frock coats or trousers are made of. If you see pea coats, for example, out on the market today, the way that even gets its name, it comes from the name of pilot cloth, which is a very dense type of cloth they're making overcoats out of in this time period and later on. Eventually, those pilot cloth coats get kind of abbreviated to pea coats, which is where we get that term today. I used to think it was PEA coat, but it's just the letter P for pilot cloth. But these pilot cloth coats, or even other broadcloth coats, other overcoats in the period, are usually made out of something a little denser, a little heavier. It's not really made to move around as easily. It's made to keep you warm. These are your main winter coat of the 19th century. Looking into different accounts, reading about winter in Kansas, I keep coming across accounts of overcoats. Either somebody's trying to swim across the Kansas River and his overcoat's too heavy because now it's wet and probably weighs 30 pounds, or somebody's trying to get off their horse and their overcoat gets caught on the saddle, or somebody's trying to unload a wagon and they take their overcoat off to make it easier. There's accounts like this all through the winter in Kansas and elsewhere, all through this time period. I'm sure some of us probably have trench coats or other jackets today. You look like you almost have an overcoat on here in the front, actually. It's pretty similar. Here's the inside of this over frock, as it would have been termed in the period, being a frock coat cut. So I'll kind of go back here and show you. The one on the left would have been one that would have been a palatot cut. Kind of a different, doesn't have the skirt protruding out from it. It would have been all the same panels, a little closer to something we may see today or in some like vintage movies. But here's the inside of the frock coat that we have, the over frock that we have on display. The buttons are a carved horn. They're a very unique button. And the inside, as you can tell, is quilted pretty extravagantly. Kind of zoomed in on one of the images on the right there to show you what that pattern looks like. Now, it looks pretty sloppy, but that person, whoever quilted this, had enough time and energy to actually put kind of a creative design in that. You see that pretty frequently on overcoats. Abraham Lincoln's overcoat used to be on display, I don't know if it still is, at Ford's Theater there in DC. And the inside of Lincoln's overcoat has the big federal crest has some patriotic slogan like "For God and the Union" or something along that sort. And it is quilted all throughout. But even lower class overcoats could still be quilted pretty extravagantly, kind of like the one we have here. And what that's going to do is just like you quilt like a blanket, it's going to take the padding and kind of set it in place. So that padding is pretty much set. It won't move around on you. You can move around the coat. It can rain on you, and you're not going to get weird wads of padding bulking up. It's going to keep everything where it sits, where you want it to be. One fashion I find very interesting is in the mid-19th century, around 1846, 48, around the same time that French fly trousers are really starting to take off, you see a trend of furred overcoats. Now, they're not quite made of fur, but it's actually an imitation fur. It's one of the earliest like faux furs that I've actually come across in garments around this time period. And they pop up all over the place in this time period. Here are two that were in the Steamboat Arabia collection that were aboard that steamboat that sank here in Kansas in 1856. And there are a couple images here in the front that show people wearing some of these. From face value, they look like they're made of fur, but they're kind of a fur cloth. There's a lot of speculation on what that cloth is made of, goat hair, horse hair, etc. That's something I'm not sure if anybody's really nailed down yet. But here's kind of a close-up of some of that as well, with a few more folks wearing these types of overcoats. And here's a close-up of one of the furred overcoats, excuse me, in the collection of the Steamboat Bertrand, or the DeSoto Nature Center, where the Steamboat Bertrand collection is held in Nebraska. It's also a pretty good image, best image I could find, of a buttonhole of this time period. So we mentioned a lot of things. Sewing machines make things a lot easier to produce as far as you can make things quicker. You can kind of cut some steps in half as far as how much time it might take. But some things like buttonholes just have to be done by hand. These are things done with a specific stitch in certain manners, very meticulously to create a buttonhole that won't tear out. If you're making a garment that's for labor or a lot of heavy work or everyday wear, you don't want that to tear out, because if you don't have buttons or buttonholes, you can't close your coat. And that's probably not going to be great for the winter time. I love hats and headgear. I'd be wearing one now, but I'd be sweating. But here are a few of my favorite hat styles I see in the mid-19th century here in Kansas. This is a very famous photo. You've probably seen it. If you've been to Johnny's, you've probably seen this photo a time or two. It's all over the place. I'm sure it's probably on display here somewhere. And this is a photo of a group called the Immortal 10. The Immortal 10 rescues John Doy in 1859, an anti-slavery man who had been arrested, sent to Missouri for helping to harbor slaves across the border to free them into free territory. And the Immortal 10, it's almost like out of a Wild West movie, ride in, some of them pose as mule thieves or horse thieves, and they are able to get into the jail, and they break everybody out of jail. They break John Doy out of jail. They ride back to Lawrence, and this series of photos were taken upon their return. So this is pretty much, according to the accounts, how they were dressed in this raid, in this adventure that they go on to rescue John Doy. And if you notice, most of these men are wearing suits, even though it may not be as flashy as Abraham Lincoln or James Buchanan, some of the higher class folks in the period. They're still wearing suits for the most part. And the folks that aren't the guy that's not wearing a suit here in the center, he's wearing an overshirt. It's his top layer. Now, this photo was taken in July, if I remember correctly, in 1859. And even in July, they're still wearing frock coats and waistcoats and overshirts. But we're really talking about the hat styles, I suppose. I kind of missed the point of the slide. The hat styles we see really vary. Top hats are very common in the time period. There's a couple on display out here in our exhibit. But other felt hats or hats made out of a felt were kind of the norm. For those of us that may not know what felt is or what hat felt might be, felt hats, if you ever see a cowboy hat that looks like it's made out of some solid substance, that's a wool or fur felt 9 times out of 10. And fur felt is usually a higher quality. Oh yeah, good question. There are. So the 10 standing up, those are the Immortal 10. And John Doy was the guy they rescued. He's the one sitting down. He had a pretty sore ride home and reportedly had to sit for the photos. There's a few different views of him that's kind of leaned over a little different in the chair. I haven't ridden on a horse hastily back from a prison for 40, 50 miles, but I'm probably a little sore too. But good observation. I didn't think to mention that. So fur felts can be shaped pretty easily. If you ever go up to the Stetson factory up in St. Joe, you may see they have a big steam machine they do this with today. Hatters in the period would also be using steam to shape these hats. You can soak these in water, you can steam them, it loosens up the fibers, and then you're able to actually shape them over what's called a hat block. All sorts of shapes in the time period. They're everything from rounded top hats, crowned hats, top hats like we see in some of these, and some of them are a little beat up where they've been serviced and used quite a bit over the years. Kind of the one over here on the mannequin behind me. So hats in the time period could also be made out of a straw. But usually for winter times, straw hats just kind of aren't really good. They don't insulate well. They don't really last well in the snow or the rain. And so most of the time you're going to see folks wearing felt hats like this in cold weather. Yeah.
Would it be unusual to wear those tall top hats? Or is that more of a class statement? Or just a fashion?
It's kind of a fashion thing. A lot of
So goofy.
they probably look pretty goofy to us today. So the top hats in this photo especially are likely felt. They're likely fur felt based on how they appear in the photo. They could also be made out of what's called silk plush. The two we have on display here are actually a silk plush, but I didn't even mention, which are kind of a paper core. And you had to take a plush materials and sewn on top of it and then brushed over and shellacked to give it that fake fur appearance, just to make it look like it's made out of a fur felt, kind of like the ones I have up here, but it's actually not. It's a lot lesser quality, a little higher quality, weighs a lot less. It doesn't take as much wear and tear, but it's a lot cheaper to make and buy. As far as wearing like silk plush top hats, people probably wouldn't wear those about every day. But I've actually come across a few accounts of where I'm from in West Virginia, originally West Virginia, of people were fascinated doing the census of how many farmers worked in silk top hats. I thought that was pretty interesting. They don't weigh very much, so it's kind of like wearing a light ball cap today. I personally don't like wearing them if I'm doing a lot of activity because they get in the way. You walk through a doorway, or it's what a problem for them, but getting in the car, you kind of can't get in, or walk through a door sometimes, or bend over and do things if that's kind of getting in your way. But you would have seen kind of that would have been more along the lines of somebody's like personal taste. If you were going out and doing something that was a somewhat formal occasion, 9 times out of 10 for formal occasions, you're going to see top hats being used, either a fur or a silk plush. Now, as opposed to hats, you also see caps being worn pretty frequently. I have a few different caps, a couple different caps up here on display. The caps we have on our screen are usually, these are sewn. This one over here might be a velvet or possibly a fur. You see different patterns of all shapes and sizes. Caps are one of those things that people would have worn a lot indoors if you're doing a lot of work outdoors, like laborers things, just like we wear a ball cap today. They could also be made out of a fur, like the one we have up here. The big difference between them, if you're trying to discern them, hats have brims and caps have visors. That's the big line that kind of separates those two. So we talked a lot about clothing. I want to talk a little bit about one of the main, one of the real essential pieces that you see in 19th century Kansas. 1850s Kansas and 1860s Kansas can really be told through the story of the buffalo herds here in Kansas. The buffalo robe was a very essential part of Kansas's economy during those territorial years. Tens of thousands are going to travel east from the plains of Kansas, Colorado, Nebraska. The buffalo robe is very universal. I'll put a great account actually to read through here real quick. Ida Ellen Rath wrote about her father, Charles Rath, was a biography. Charles Rath was a famous Indian trader, buffalo hunter, and early Kansas pioneer. Now, she wrote this, I believe, in the 1870s or 80s, but she's talking about those early territorial years in the account. Various industries found many uses for the tough buffalo hide after it was tanned. The buffalo robe business was enormous. Few owners of buggies and surreys would have had them outside of the barn without 1 or 2 buffalo robes to tuck around passengers' knees. Buffalo robe went over the wagon seat, and another robe covered the knees. Every sitting room had a robe on the center of the floor. There was another on the floor beside the bed. The robes were felt lined for a higher quality or higher priced rug with a 3-toned scalloped edge. Quite likely, a bed would have a buffalo robe for a spread. In the days of cold houses and no night fires, oh, what warmth. Almost any old timer can remember their menfolk clad in winter with a buffalo hide overcoat. Any man who was out in the open in winter would have had one of these warm overcoats. They had great wide collars that turned up as high as a man's head, the shaggy brown black fur and tough hide giving a man warmth. This listing does not take into account the use of Plains Indians using buffalo hides as well, which most of those buffalo robes getting sent east are actually tanned by Plains Indians who are trading these for different goods as a part of the buffalo robe trade. With the hair left on, the tan hides made rugs for the lodge, spread for the bed, both over and under the sleeper. The hairless hide was used for coverings for the lodge and clothing for the men and women, skirts, shirts, jackets, leggings, and moccasins. So people in Kansas all over, east and west, whether they were living in Kansas or living in a Cheyenne village in the western Kansas border, are all using buffalo robes. Buffalo is going to really be the thing that really keeps a lot of people warm here during that time period. Here's a great daguerreotype in the Nick Vaquero collection that shows a man in a sleigh, and it's a daguerreotype, so it's earlier 1850s, with what seems like a buffalo robe over his knees, just like Reed's account in the previous slide. Yeah, fur clothing was very popular in Kansas. This photo here on the right is of Joseph Pomeroy Root, or early Kansas pioneer, and I believe the first lieutenant governor of Kansas, who becomes lieutenant governor in 1861. He's seen in this early 1850s daguerreotype wearing a fur overcoat, similar to the one we see over here on the left in another private collection. Fur collars were another pretty popular way to use furs. They could be made out of buffalo, other furs as well. Bear furs are used pretty frequently as well as a pretty warm one. One of the Free State soldiers we see in Lawrence in 1856 is actually wearing a fur collar over top of his overshirt, kind of like the one we have here on the table. So it didn't have to necessarily be worn over a coat. A lot of times people were wearing these like scarves. And this is one of my favorite Kansas Jayhawkers, Charles Jennison. He becomes very famous for kind of establishing that Jayhawk name and really creating that reputation that leads into the Civil War, and then starting numerous regiments during the Civil War here in Kansas. Jennison is seen in this copy of an early image of him here in Kansas with a Beecher's Bible in his left hand, and he's wearing fur gauntlets similar to the ones we see over here on the left from around that time period. On the left, we see Wyandotte County citizen Isaac Brown. He shows up wearing a fur hat and a wool overcoat in this 1850s daguerreotype, showing how he was dressed for a bear hunt. Isaac Brown was, I believe, half Wyandotte Indian. He lived in Wyandotte County, Kansas, at the town of Wyandotte, which is, I believe, no longer there. It's now it's part of pretty much KCK, Kansas City, Kansas. And he actually, Brown would later trade his Indian status for U.S. citizenship in 1855, a year after the land becomes open for white settlement. So he gives up that Indian status, but a few years later, he's going to move down to the rest of the Wyandotte tribal lands down in present-day Oklahoma. Fur wasn't just used by men, it was used by a lot of women as well. Buffalo furs are a little less common for clothing for ladies, but you see other furs being used pretty frequently. You may see collars, capes, fur muffs, kind of like the one we have. Here it is, right here. These are to keep your hands warm in the wintertime. A lot of times you may see people, you still see these a lot if you go to Bass Pro Shops. I think a lot of bow hunters use these to keep their hands warm. But ladies in the 19th century are going to use these pretty frequently as well. You may see these wrapped around with a cord around the neck so you can leave your hands free and this doesn't really fall away or you don't lose it. And these are pretty common from ladies all through that period. I've found dozens of pictures of ladies from the 1840s, 50s, and 60s with fur muffs. I had to pick just a few of them to put in the slides here. And the lady on the right has an entire fur cape on with her muff here as well. I'm sure I probably would have been pretty warm.
Christian.
Oh, yeah.
I noticed you had some kind of
I do. This is a buffalo robe or a buffalo fur here. The reason they're called buffalo robes, if that may be a little confusing for folks, the hide itself is called the robe because Plains Indians pretty typically are going to wear those wrapped around with the fur side in. That's the comfy side. You're going to wrap it around you kind of like a robe. That's how you're holding that on yourself. It's kind of like it's a blanket. It's kind of like wearing a blanket. So even folks that are buying those and shipping them east, even in New England, they're still calling them robes or mattresses sometimes even. But this is a buffalo fur here. So after we're all set and done, I want you guys to make sure we come up, make sure you feel the buffalo robe and feel what that actually feels like. Here's a pair of fur-lined shoes in the Steamboat Arabian collection as well. I found a few references to these being shipped out to Kansas specifically all through the 1850s. These are pretty commonly made for women, but I see them in other references to just men and women's boots. So it's pretty possible these are made for men as well. And these have been pretty darn cozy. So one material that we may not think about a whole lot when we think of winter clothing is rubber. It's kind of what we don't really think about a whole lot. A lot of our shirts and clothing and coats today are made out of synthetics, made out of nylons, polyesters. These are synthetics, pretty much plastics anyway. But rubbers, or natural rubbers, India rubber, starts to become really popular around the time that Kansas is opened for settlement in the mid-1850s. Here's a close-up of one of the overcoats in Steamboat Bertrand collection. And that shows a pretty good view of kind of what that rubber would look like up close. By the mid-1840s, Charles Goodyear, yes, that same Goodyear that makes tires today, Charles Goodyear is going to patent that process, the big vulcanization process that makes it possible to make pliable, pretty much pliable, flexible rubber for clothing or wearable goods. You're going to see this being made into canteens, knapsacks for bags or haversacks for people that are going across to California in the gold rush. You see a lot of overcoats. You even see waders, boots, shoes, hats, all that kind of stuff's made out of rubber at that time period. Rubber was really starting to really take off. It was one of those things that you may not think of it being an insulative layer, but that rubber is a very good insulator. So you get to have something that's just as warm as a buffalo fur overcoat, but it weighs maybe a fifth of the weight. And it's a lot thinner, and you can fold it up, and it takes a lot less space. Here on the left, we have a daguerreotype taken in 1849, a little before Kansas was open for settlement. This man, Dr. Macbeth, is actually crossing over to California, first year of the California Gold Rush. He crosses the plains of Kansas, and I'm not sure how far he makes, but he actually passes away from cholera during one of those big epidemics in 1849 as he was traveling west. He's seen in a rubber overcoat similar to this one. This is the whole coat that we saw on the last slide, made by, in the collection of Steve Bertrand. But yes, Dr. Macbeth, in the costume in which he crossed the plains, fleeing from cholera, in which he died. He didn't quite make it to California, but I'm sure the overcoat or the raincoat would have kept him warm.
Eric, we're just about out of time.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'll speed through these real quick. Here on the right, we have an image of a stagecoach driver. All through the 1850s, stagecoach is real essential to Kansas's history and Kansas expansion. This stagecoach driver chooses to wear a rubber overcoat with his ensemble. We also have a rubber rain cap, rubber insoles for shoes. If you'd like, I can also share the PowerPoint with folks if they'd like to flip through these on. And some of those rubber shoes that we may see in some of those accounts might look like the one here on the right. One Kansas general store, one Kansas trading post owned by Mr. Moses Grinter. What now is pretty much Kansas City, Kansas, where I work for the Kansas Historical Society. He sold these shoes for $3 to $3.50 per pair. They're pretty cheap comparatively. And here's the bottom pair of those shoes as well. We can wrap it up here if you'd like.
Yeah, we did have a couple of questions online.
All right.
So we had someone asking, are you familiar with the J.T. Martin company? It was a ready-made clothing company in St. Louis. Have you heard of them?
Yeah, I've come across J.T. Martin from New York quite a bit. A lot of Civil War buffs will talk about the contracts of the military clothing in New York, but they were a private clothing firm much before the Civil War.
Okay. And then the other question was, going back to the trousers, what material are the trousers lined with?
That's a good question. Usually they're lined in a lighter cotton. Sometimes they can be lined in a what's called polished cotton, which is pretty similar to some of the stuff you may see on this pair of trousers here or on the back of a waistcoat coming from here. Usually the polished cotton actually has a glaze to it. This one's been worn so much it's kind of rubbed off. But a lot of polished cotton in the period is shiny, and the way that's done is with a heat press. And the reason that that's so popular for linings is it kind of makes it easier to glide your legs in and out. It doesn't quite create as much friction. So it's easier to take them on and off without having to worry about things bunching or catching on your drawers or your socks. All right. Were there any more questions online?
No.
That's all we're going to
What would you warn to the Waterloo War in November of 1957?
So I looked quite a bit into that, believe it or not. And most of the troops during that period that are Kansas troops, anti-slavery troops coming to defend Lawrence, a lot of those folks are showing up in the same things they were wearing every day, clothing. We've seen a lot of accounts of overcoats and overfrocks in that time period. There's a lot of other accounts as well of folks in just shirts. A lot of fur, I assume, would have been here as well. People probably were sleeping on buffalo robes. But a lot of the companies, there were 9 infantry companies and 1 mounted cavalry company in that the brigade, as they called it, the Kansas Brigade, commanded by Jim Lane. A lot of those companies were pre-established militias and had some sort of uniform. And I say that in air quotes because it's one of those things that one company, for example, like the Topeka Guard, which was established in, they were based out of Constitution Hall, was their arsenal there in Topeka. They had a militia. They ensured they had arms that were equipped only for about 25 of them, but about 75 people respond to the call and come to defend Lawrence. So I'm sure you would have had some folks in uniforms that would have really varied. That would have been similar to military uniforms of the period. You see frock coats in like a military cut, a little different than the one we have on today. But you've also seen plenty, if not more, folks responding to that call to defend Lawrence in the everyday clothing they were used to wearing.
Eric, we did have another question. Any distinct differences between normal coats and overcoats other than thicker cloth?
That's a great question. There are styling differences. A lot of times you see overcoats that have more commonly you can see overcoats with external pockets than typical frock coat. That's not a thing that's, an all or one. You see daily, just everyday suit coats, especially working class coats that also have pockets. The main thing that really comes down to making it an overcoat is if it's made with the intention to be worn over another. So overcoats sometimes can have hooks and eyes on the underside with a flap that can cover across the neck. Sometimes the overcoats can be made in a way that it's easier with a larger, what's they call an arm's eye, the part that you put your sleeve through. You may see the sleeve being a little wider, a little looser, and it's usually made proportionally to fit over the physique of a frock coat or a normal everyday suit coat, rather than to fit over the physique of a waistcoat, which is a little bit of a different shape. A lot of overcoats, especially if they're paletot cut pattern, which is all one panel rather than a separate skirt. A lot of those overcoats are a lot looser fitting, so you can wear extra layers underneath. It's a lot easier to stuff layers underneath. You can wear a sweater, an overshirt, a vest, and a frock coat, and then your overcoat. It's a lot easier to do that than to stuff things underneath of a more fitted suit jacket, kind of like this. Good question.
There's some accounts when people encounter Hugh Cameron, they remark about his homespun cloth. Is that what would that signify? Is that crafty? Is that eccentric? Is that like 1870s cottagecore?
Good question. So a lot of wools in the period, you have a lot of domestic or like homespun cloths you see in the period. A lot of those are blends. You can see homespun wools, just plain wools. I have a great example of a homespun blanket that's just pure wool. But you also see a lot of these being mixed. So a lot of homespun cloth that a lot of folks may encounter in their research are jean cloths and or satinettes, cassinets, things that are part cotton and part wool. And the thing that makes all those fabrics different is the way that they're woven, what the warp is, what the weft is, and how they're woven together. Satinettes, for example, have a cotton core and a wool outside, so it looks like the coat that I have on here, but on the underside of the cloth, you'll see that it's actually a different warp on the underside. So homespun cloths you can see mostly being wool cotton mixes. But you might also, I've seen wool hemp mixes. I've seen cotton silk mixes that are homespuns even. I don't know how they're getting silk fibers, but you see different mixes of that as well. As soon as you cross the border into Missouri in the 1850s, night and day split. People are still weaving their cloth. It's to an extent cheaper and easier. It's a little more self-sustaining. But as you cross into Kansas, you start to see that a lot less. You have less established towns. Missouri had been around for 40, 45 years before Kansas is open for settlement. As far as they were state, I'm terrible at math. So something around that. So they've been around for a while. There was infrastructure there. People were creating things, but there wasn't as much, new markets available for them. There were, but it wasn't quite as much of a popular thing as it was here in Kansas. A lot of that also comes down to people's background. We mentioned a little earlier. If you were coming from an area like Georgia, you're used to weaving your own cloth or buying homespun domestic cloths like that. And a lot of those cloths are being used for work clothing or labor clothing. You may see overcoats made out of that type of cloth. You see suits made out of it, but most of the time it's for things that are for labor. Work pants, work jackets, even overshirts sometimes.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you guys for coming. Check out the exhibit and scan that QR code so you can read all about the artifacts there. And I'm going to stay up here, and as long as Will lets me, and show you guys everything we have up here as well. Come on up and check it out.